Hi, I'm Jim Morris, and I'm the president here at Pixar Animation Studios.
I'm really excited to chat with you. I was curious about your early career. How did you first get involved in film?
In the early '80s, I was running a couple different commercial production companies, and I was working as a basically executive producer and producer. But at that time, I had moved to California in hopes of getting into the movie business. In fact, I was living in upstate New York working for a PBS station, and I saw Black Stallion, and I quit my job, packed up my Chevette, and drove to San Francisco in hopes of going to work for Carol Ballard. I actually didn't meet him for till 15 years later, so my original plan didn't quite pan out. But I got into the advertising business first. I met a director who said, "Well, if you want to learn how to do large scale production, commercials, do it in a kind of little compact way, and you could learn stuff." So I started working at a couple of ad agencies, and then I ended up running a couple little commercial production companies. And at that point in time, I met a guy named Charlie McGuire, and Charlie was head of production at Lucasfilm. It was around the time they were making Tucker, and they made Howard the Duck, and they were planning to make a lot more original films. He'd been a guy who'd run production at Paramount that George knew. Anyway, I met him, and he had nothing for me there, and it wasn't that. But he one day said, ILM, they're having a slow year, and so they were thinking of getting into commercial production. Would you want to help them out with that? So I went over to ILM and went through about 28 interviews, is what happens at ILM and Pixar when you're getting a job. You meet pretty much everybody in the world, and they get to weigh in on you. I got hired basically to write a business plan for them to get into commercials, and then put a little commercial wing of the company together. And at my earliest opportunity, when asked, I jumped over to the feature side and brought in somebody else to run commercials. And I had a very important and auspicious start in the movie business. I produced the effects on Caddyshack 2. Not the good Caddyshack, but nonetheless, it was a great experience. And then I went on to get some other movies. I did a couple Blake Edwards pictures with Michael Owens, who had done Caddyshack 2 as well, but then ended up working with Dennis Muren on The Abyss, which was a bit of a breakthrough film for us, of course, and working with Jim on that. And then right around the same time, right on the heels of that, I got together with Joe Johnston, and we did the work on Always, which was the Spielberg picture. And kind of the fun thing about that was, we're doing The Abyss, which was kind of cutting edge CG, and we're doing Always, where we were going back to the same gags the Lydecker brothers had used in the 30s and 40s to do films and so forth. So it was this interesting balance, I think we ended up with one optical shot in Always. Everything else was in camera practical with giant flying miniatures and wire hangers and stuff. And meanwhile, we're doing The Abyss, trying to figure out how to render water and so forth. And so it was this very interesting dialectic between those two projects. And it was sort of telling because The Abyss was sort of the film that started the transformation into the digital side and computer graphics in live action pictures. Of course, we were doing that work. Pixar had been in the same premises as where we were for Industrial Light and Magic. We'd shared the space. They'd been part of the same company, obviously. They left behind a film recorder and a few other things that we used to actually do the shots in The Abyss, which you'll be interested probably to know, and you may know already. They were all optically composited except for one shot, so we were filming out elements. It's funny in the digital age to be thinking about that, but we're filming out, beauty pass and matte pass and so forth, and then comping them in. But those were the earlier films I worked on at ILM, and then got kind of kicked upstairs after those to help oversee all the productions. They were starting to get a lot more work in. And since I'd been so involved in The Abyss and kind of a little bit on the ground floor, at least from the producer side, understanding computer graphics and how to make all that work, and obviously very, very primitive early times in that. So that was kind of how I got into the movie racket in the first place.
What's a good start? I was curious, like you were talking about Abyss, like what was it like during that time, especially, I think for everyone in visual effects, you always think of Terminator 2, Jurassic Park, The Abyss being one of the Kickstarters.
Yeah, it was interesting. The Abyss, Jim could have come up with some other way to tell the story in The Abyss without having the pseudopod, probably. So we wanted to make that work. There was also a big wave sequence that wasn't in the original release, but we put it in the Laserdisc version when it came out. It was that long ago. When we got to Terminator 2, it had to work. The polyalloy character was kind of pivotal to making the show work. And there's some parts and pieces that Stan Winston did, but by and large, it's the character that we made. And Jim, of course, is a very rigorous director and had very high demands for it. Dennis Muren was supervising, of course, who has splendid taste. So that was really an interesting one. We learned a lot of stuff in terms of, we were matching Robert Patrick, the actor who played the T-1000. And we would photograph him. We realized, he had certain things, like he had a soccer injury and it gave him a slight limp and so forth. So we weren't doing motion capture or anything at that point in time, but we started measuring those things to try to get those little quirks into the character, even though it was a polyalloy character, those types of things. So that was an interesting one. The show that gets overlooked sometimes, kind of in the arc of those, was Death Becomes Her. You had the Goldie Hawn character had a hole in her at a certain point that you could see through. But more importantly, Meryl Streep, when she is pushed down the steps and her neck breaks and her head's turned around 180 degrees, the from here to the bottom of her head was essentially a computer graphics appliance. We did all of that in CG, the twisted neck, and filmed her head and body separately and then put them together. And the reason I mention it is, it's, as far as I'm aware, it's the first time we or anyone really tried to do digital skin. And you had to make it look enough lifelike that it worked. Fortunately, they were heavily made up in their roles, since they were kind of spray painting themselves to cover up their age and so forth. But that became a bit of the basis for the skinning of the dinosaurs in Jurassic Park. So there were all these little building blocks along the way as we're kind of going through that journey. And there's obviously lots of stories, truth, folklore, beliefs, jaded memories surrounding the beginning of Jurassic Park. But the punchline was, Mark Tappé and Steve Williams came up. They just did a little test originally with kind of just a T-Rex skeleton walking through a plate we shot up at Skywalker Ranch. And when Steven saw it, he just, even with no skin or anything on it, its lifelikeness was so compelling that's what sort of precipitated the change away from Stan Winston doing stop motion dinosaurs. All we were going to do was comp his dinosaurs originally. So it ended up with us doing the dinosaur work, albeit Phil stayed in the mix, of course, because he's such a great animator and animal behaviorist that we built, as I know you well know, the DID, the dinosaur input device, so that we had photo-optical encoders at each of the joints so he could set a pose. And I think we streamed it into Softimage back then, and that became the basis for a lot of the performances. And then we did a bunch of them at ILM as well. But Phil and the flavor of his animal observation and behavior knowledge was sort of what really infused it with, I think, more credibility than it might have had otherwise. So that was really a pivotal moment. I remember, as I said, I was head of production at that time, and all of these scripts start flying in. Every agent and director and producer had a script that there's just no way to make this. And then suddenly they see Jurassic Park and they go like, oh my God, if they can make dinosaurs do that, then I guess we can do anything. So it really was the film that unleashed, I think, the flow of stuff into the digital world. I have a fun fact about that film, because people's memories of it are that they're kind of watching wall-to-wall dinosaurs in that movie. And the fact of the matter is, there are 52 computer graphic shots in that movie. And I think 102 shots that are parts and pieces that Stan Winston did, like a foot here, or the eggs when they're kind of going through the lab area and so forth, stuff that Stan made, sometimes a claw opening a door or something like that. So when you think about a movie like that had 150 effect shots total, including the practical stuff, and it's a 2.5-hour movie, but people's memory of it is that there's so much more in it than that. And I think that's a testament to Spielberg's genius, really. Such a good storyteller, and he's so clever. There's a scene when Nedry's rushing to the boat dock to get some DNA that he's trying to sell, and he crashes. He comes in contact with the spitter. The spitter originally was a walking creature that Stan Winston's folks had built, but on the day of the shoot, it didn't work. And so they said, well, we'll fix it. We'll come back another day and see if it said, I can't do it. So instead, if you watch the movie, it doesn't actually ever walk, but every time the Nedry character turns around to see where it is, it's closer to him. And it's much scarier and better and than if you'd seen it tracking behind him or something. And it's just the kind of thing that Steven does. You're like, oh yeah, he is the maestro of that kind of thing, of that kind of storytelling. He's superb. So great experience for everybody. Even Phil ended up having it work out okay for him. He got an Oscar out of it, even if he was fired from the show for a minute.
That's right. You're talking about limitations such as with the spitter not being able to walk, running into situations like that, not even to do with visual effects, but more to do with operations. I'm just kind of curious for you, do you find that limitations, constraints, things like that really help people thrive in those situations versus carte blanche, having infinite opportunity?
I absolutely think having limitations is what gets artists, whether they're effects artists, directors, whomever, to do their best work. When they have to be inventive, I sort of feel like when you have everything at your disposal, there's a lack of discipline that comes with that, and a lack of inventiveness that comes with it. We all know, I didn't work on Jaws or anything like that when Steven did that movie, but we all know the stories of the things he did when those animatronics weren't working and the way he cut around it. And it's much scarier. The stuff you don't see but you think you see is the great stuff in that movie. And I've worked on a lot of movies at ILM over the years, and sometimes directors, even Steven at times, would have so much stuff at their disposal, and they made their weakest films, I think, at those points in times when they have to kind of think things up and be inventive. I'm thrilled that visual effects now is so important to almost every movie that gets made. Almost every film has something in it, and some films have so much in it. But I do feel at times I miss some of the practical things we used to do and the workarounds we used to do and the kind of sleight of hand we needed to do to pull things off. It was a little more magical, and people are doing such great work now that it's really difficult to criticize it. And I'm not criticizing it, but I do feel like the ability to kind of do almost anything you can imagine in the computers, taking a little bit of an edge off imagining how to tell your story well without quite as much of that support and without quite as many of those tools.
I always think that the shows that I'm bidding, the ones that aren't just, let's just do it all in CG. It's about like, how are we going to pull this shot off? Okay, well, that's all practical. We can, do some stuff over here and there, but those are the fun ones to kind of look at the payoff.
CG work has gotten so superb that people could have a different opinion about this and be totally valid. But I've always found the shows that are a mix, that have a bit of practical, a bit of miniature, a bit of CG. There's something about them that make them feel more realistic to me, because I think there's more grounded reality. Things are more rooted in reality if you've got miniatures or some practical stuff. The sleight of hand's a little bit better because you can't pick up on the CG as much when it's a mix of things in there. So I like it when I see that, when people have taken the effort to kind of go through and try to mix up the approaches a bit.
I'd love to talk a bit about your transition to Pixar, but for that, I was just kind of curious if there's any particular projects or stories that really kind of stand out to you during your tenure at ILM.
The Jurassic Park transition and navigating Phil getting taken off that movie, I ended up being one of the people to have that conversation with him. I'm not sure why exactly, because the highly paid producers on the movie probably should have, but I somehow ended up with that particular task. I've mentioned a bit about The Abyss and Always as being sort of so emblematic of the kind of the two halves of the effects world at that point in time. We had a lot of movies go through, but around the time of Jurassic Park, of course, we also did Forrest Gump. And I look at that as, a kind of an equally important film to Jurassic in its use of, I'll call invisible effects, we call them supporting effects or whatever. I think we replaced about 100 skies in that movie to kind of create the mood that Bob did, that they'd be too blue and sunny sometimes, and he needed to be a little more oppressive and dour. Obviously, there's mouth morphine stuff and so forth that happens in that, but there's just a lot of visual effects in that film. They're there to serve a different purpose. We removed Gary Sinise's legs so he could play the legless Dan character. I kind of felt like it was the first time I really saw visual effects help an actor perform. It made his character possible and made him, he was superb at figuring out how to do stuff so that when we did the leg removal, it seemed, very authentic and genuine. But I think of that movie, you think of Jurassic Park and you think of that film, and it's almost like going back to, the roots of cinema. Méliès on the one hand and the brothers on the other hand, they're making these realistic films, and Méliès is making these fantastic films. And so it was an interesting time to be there and kind of go through that transition from, photochemical, photographic to digital, and being there at that time and seeing the different forces and influence. And it was such a small industry back then. ILM was the biggest company at the time, even when we only had 400, 500 people there. And now that's, there's so many huge companies out there and facilities doing work now. Is quite a thing to say.
Yeah, I think before you have, your top five, and now it's almost every studio is globalized in some shape or fashion if they've been around for more than a decade. Yeah.
Different time indeed. We used to talk and say, like, one day every film will be using stuff like this, and then you get down the road a little bit, you kind of go like, careful what you wish for.
Yeah, I can agree there. And I was curious too about when you felt it was time to move on and your experience trying to decide what the next step was for you after ILM.
I had been at ILM 17 years, and by the time I got to the end, I was overseeing ILM, Skywalker Sound, and Lucasfilm Animation. We hadn't really done much at Lucasfilm Animation at that point. They've done a lot of TV, but that wasn't happening when I was there. We were trying to make some movies, and the reason that started was when we ramped up for George to do episodes 1, 2, and 3. We added people so that we had our normal amount of people available to work for Steven or Bob Zemeckis or Joe Johnston or whomever was coming to us for work. So our base level was about 1,200 people, and we had a couple hundred more so that we'd have the headroom to do George's films on top of that. When George was in between films, we had this kind of trough in utilization. So we thought, like, well, it'd be great if we could be an animation facility for someone. Universal came in and they were interested in doing a Frankenstein digital film.
I was going to ask if Frankenstein was one of these.
Yeah, it was the one. Basically, a guy named Casey Silver was running the studio at the time, and I'd done a lot of work for Universal, and he was he's a great guy, a friend, and so forth. And he greenlit this film, and we started working on it. Now, to be perfectly honest, we didn't really know what we were doing. We were so used to getting scripts for visual effects, breaking them down, and then they'd shoot the plates and they'd shoot the movie and we'd do our piece, and that worked great. So we didn't realize all of the steps involved and the disciplines involved when you did it all yourself. The guys that wrote the Tremors script basically wrote our first script, and we read it and goes, great, perfect. We actually had an animation producer come in and say, we've got to put this up on reels. We were making these very precise animatics in each little scene that were animated and everything. This guy comes in just teaches us how to do it with rough boards and so forth. And we put the thing up and realized kind of what a disaster it was as a movie. There were so many things you learn when you put things up in reels. So we were working on that. Casey left Universal, and his successor was not a huge fan of the movie. And so the movie eventually got shut down, but the money from the movie we retained basically so that we could do another movie that would be Universal's. And so we started doing a lot of development and looking at different projects. And, George was kind of the father of Pixar in a way, if you think about it. It was the Lucasfilm computer graphics group that then got sold to Steve. And George knew how hard it was to make one of these movies. We pitched him a bunch of things and had a bunch of credible people involved in them, credible directors and writers and so forth. But it was a little bit slow to happen. And also I was realizing at that point I'd been kind of in management there. I'd gone there to be a producer, and I'd produced some stuff and then got kicked upstairs. And I was thinking, like, I think I want to make some more stuff before I'm done with this. I mean, not that I'm happy to do the executive stuff and kind of keep the sandbox working okay. But so I talked to George and basically said, I think I want to go produce some stuff. And he was totally gracious. We built a long exit timeline and so forth. And so I could put other people in place and so forth. Anyway, Ed Catmull had become a good friend of mine. And he had become a good friend of mine because we'd met early on when I was at ILM. And I had never run a company, and he had neither, really. And so we would get together frequently and just like, well, how are you dealing with this? And how are you keeping your artists happy here? And we would share technology and so forth, because we'd been the same company. Now we sort of felt like sister companies. And we just generally helped each other out and tried to figure out things in a collegial way. And so I just coincidentally was having lunch with Ed around this time that I had this conversation with George. And I said, keep it to yourself, Ed, but I'm gonna be taken off. I think I want to produce some animation. And I'd had a conversation with Jeffrey Katzenberg, who'd expressed interest in me coming down when he was still at DreamWorks. And Ed said, oh, good, we had a movie we wanted to talk to you about anyway. And that was WALL-E. I came and met Andrew Stanton, and we hit it off. I worked on so many science fiction films, and I grew up on so many. I kind of felt like I'd been in basic training my whole life to make a movie about a lonely robot. So that worked out. And when I left Lucas, I came over to Pixar here and started making that film with Andrew. And
here you are.
there we are. And finished that film. I was not through with that film when we got acquired by Disney. And at that point in time, my boss was a woman named Sarah MacArthur, who left for some personal reasons, some family reasons and so forth. So they asked me to take a production job again. I turned down several times until I realized I wasn't actually allowed to turn it down anymore. So I finished WALL-E though as the producer on that. And then since that point, for a couple of years, I was head of production and then became general manager and president at some point. Ed and I shared so much stuff. I don't know when. I think I've been officially president for 8 years or 9 years, but Ed was very much about the company and how the organism functioned. And I would say my part of the job was to, much more of a movie guy, and I was making sure the movies were going through and getting everybody what they needed there. So we're a pretty good partnership that way, and are great friends to this day. And I learned a lot from Ed over the years. So
I love that. I was curious, like, for what you seek out more on the producing animation and producing movie side, assuming it's more the creative influence, I was curious for you in your current role, do you still manage to find those areas to have that influence?
Yes, and I'm lucky to be able to do that. And I would say dealing with those issues probably takes up roughly half my time for a couple reasons. As we go through our creative process here, I may know a bit about our process, but generally we ask either a director who's done a movie or somebody we think may have the aptitude or the skill to do it to pitch us 3 ideas. And then if we select one of those, we germinate it, and we pair them with a writer, maybe ahead of story, and they'll do a treatment. And then if that passes muster, they'll, do an outline or a scriptment or a script. And then if that all passes muster, eventually they'll go into storyboarding and put the show up on reels. And our process takes about 5 years generally. That first year, if we're lucky, first year and a half, we get a set of reels up and we're moving forward on it. And then over time, the other pieces, the design elements and so forth come in. The physical production of the movie happens in the last couple of years when we're actually animating individual shots and, lighting and shading and rendering and doing all the other filmmaking things, scoring and so forth. So it takes a long time. And I'm involved at each of those decision milestones. If it's the selecting a pitch, the treatment, the outline, script, the first set of reels, then every set of reels we do what we call a brain trust session. But it's really a session where we get the other directors and some of the writers and a few other key people to look at the film and be very blunt about what's working, not working, make suggestions about what the fixes might be, and then give all that information to the directors so they can, and producers, so they can go back and kind of figure out, well, we get that note, but maybe here's a way to solve it, or, we're going to try this out. And then they put another set of reels up. We put now generally about 8 sets of reels up before we finish a show. So every 3 or 4 months, we see another rough hand-drawn version of the movie. Every couple seconds is a different panel, but it's not animated or anything like that. And we do scratch music and scratch voices. And we go through, and some stuff starts to get concrete poured around it, and other sequences continue to evolve, and we put things in production and so forth. So it's a long process. And since it takes so long to make them, and since we're doing a movie and a half a year, there's a lot of projects at different phases of where they are in that arc of being done. And so each one of those has a lot of milestones, and I'm in each of those milestone discussions and give notes. Look, we've got, Pete Doctor's the chief creative officer. We have some superb directors and writers here. So I would say in some ways, I tend to be kind of try to just be the raw audience and looking at stuff and like what's working for me or not, because I'm not in the room every day trying to sort through the details. So I have a little bit more objectivity, but also I have to speak for these projects to our bosses at Disney and be conversant and savvy about them so I can represent them correctly, good and bad, right? Not everything always goes smoothly. So that's a great fun part of my job, really. The rest of it's all the stuff that all executives do. I'm involved in looking at all the marketing on the films and so forth. But a lot of my time is dealing with people stuff, getting directors into roles, dealing with HR issues, being there. It's hard to make these films. People go through rough times and they need a little guidance at times on them. So I oversee our head of production and our development process and finance, human resources, legal, our technology groups. We have about 100 people here who build software and maintain it, and probably about 80 people in systems that keep all the disks spinning and all the workstations working and that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of those types of things involved as well. So I would say about half is kind of that general administrative over those areas, and then about half of it's creatively driven. I spend a lot of time with Pete Doctor. If we looked at the studio as a movie, I'm the producer and he's the director. I guess I'd look at it that way. And we kind of think of it that way because we don't want it to feel corporate-y or bureaucratic. So if you kind of feel like it's a living organism, just like it is when you're making a movie, it's just a different mental model for how you approach it. It also makes it more fun. It keeps it more fresh and so forth. So
absolutely. I love that. Just on that subject, actually, I was curious, like, what's a typical day in the life for you as president of Pixar?
It depends which day it is. I usually spend the day in LA. Allan Bergman, who runs all of the Disney studios, is my boss, and we have a meeting with him and Bob Iger every Monday. So I go down and spend that day doing check-ins with colleagues there and so forth, and some of the more corporate people and other colleagues down there. But most days, it wouldn't be unusual to come in and have a screening of a film, and then a little bit of a regroup with a small group that'll guide the brain trust, and we'll kind of get our notes together and get in sync. And then I might have a meeting with a director on a different film, and then maybe a lunch with our head of HR, and then a check-in with our legal people. There's always something going on, that whether it's a clearance or some sort of issue, or a talent issue, negotiation issue, writer, actor, that kind of thing. And then maybe I'll have a check-in with our chief technology officer, and we constantly have little projects going on with milestones if we're making a new piece of software or writing some new code, and kind of go over that. It wouldn't be unusual at that point to go into a brain trust from that morning screening and spend 90 minutes kind of giving notes and hearing other people's notes and so forth, and then trying to wrap that up. And then typically I might go for a meeting with the development group for a period of time after that. And hopefully it's starting to wind down by then. Maybe a little marketing at the end of the day, a check-in. My days are back-to-back meetings, basically, with all those different constituencies. It's a nice mix of creative and administrative stuff and so forth. And I think I've come to realize that that's probably what I'm good at, because there's some very good producers here. I think I'm a pretty good producer. Keeping everything working for everybody else and kind of keeping the environment correct and working to make these movies and so forth is really, when you get down to it, what my job is and what I think my contribution is here.
That's great. And you mentioned a few times about brain trust. I read Ed Catmull's book, Creative Inc., a few years back, and that was something that I absolutely loved and took away from that book was the creative process and surrounding yourself with the right people to get that critical feedback. How important is it to have those kind of trustworthy sources that you can get critical feedback from versus everyone, which obviously is a bit destructive?
Well, it's crazy. So the term brain trust originally came from way back in the day when Andrew Stanton would get John Lasseter and Pete Docter and Lee Unkrich together. And when you hear it now, it sounds kind of pompous, and it didn't really start out that way. So we almost want to say it's like getting people together that can help you out. And I think we do two things here I will tell you about. I do think that the brain trust idea and having that group of colleagues that know how to look at something can sort of figure out what's working or not working and then offer solutions, because a lot of people can pick something apart, but offering a solution path, that's when it's really helpful. Having that is invaluable and probably been the key to our success. Not every movie, is a home run, but we've had a good track record, and I think it's because of that. And I think it's because of the honesty and purity of that. And one of the reasons that that's possible is because everybody in that brain trust at one point or another is in the hot seat themselves. They're making a film and all of those colleagues are doing the same thing for them. So it has to be a room where everybody has to trust everybody's intentions to make the film the best. And that's how it's played out. It's very gratifying to watch and to see the stuff that comes out of it. It's not easy, and it's not like everybody comes in with the same note. So the filmmakers go away with this kind of spectrum of comments, and they try to figure out what's the right thing to fix my film? If you've seen 8 screenings of a film, it's possible you can kind of lose perspective. It's even possible you can become part of the problem. Right? What we try to do is also screen the film internally. Sometimes it's for these brain trust screenings, but we'll fill the theater, and it'll have people from finance or people from HR or people from legal or people from the cafe. And we have an online system that they can kind of give their notes. Some of it's multiple choice or rank, this kind of thing. And we don't use that to get granular notes on things, but if you've got 3/4 of the viewers saying like, I didn't understand why that guy went into the room there. Some of the stuff that may be even a vestige of an earlier set of reels that's still hanging in there or whatever. You just get it's almost like a little audience preview. Everybody there's just seeing it for the first time. And so you kind of see some patterns of response there. It's not like the brain trust where you're coming in and tearing it apart and trying to find ways to fix stuff, but you can see some trends that you need to address, and that's helpful. So we do get the voices of many, but we use it in a different way. And to your original question, having that brain trust of these people that have spent now years and years and years looking at films and figuring out how to talk about it and analyze it and predict problems and so forth. We all watch movies and go like, that wasn't as good as I thought it could be. But having people that go like, the problem was when you set this up in Act 1, it didn't pay off at the end of all the things that, I know you go through when you're dealing with the films and shows you're working on, but just having that sense of how's the 3-act show work and what's the character's arc and all of those things that you develop a vocabulary for and an ability to diagnose. And it's really the key to success here, I think.
That's great. I like that a lot, in fact. And I was curious, just while we're on the subject, is there any behind-the-scenes stories from Pixar's most challenging projects, like anything that comes to mind that you might want to share? I'm sure there's plenty.
Well, certainly.
Chapter 1.
First thing I'll share is that the first set of reels you put up can be an unmitigated disaster. It's only topped when the first set of reels aren't too bad, and then the second set of reels are an unmitigated disaster, where you start thinking like, what were we thinking? Why did we think that was a clever idea? And it's very common in our process to just kind of find that the stuff you thought was working just wasn't, and having to kind of go back to the drawing board a bit and start over, and having the intestinal fortitude to do that. It's such a different process, from live action when you think about it. I've thought about it a lot, and I learned when we were trying to do that Frankenstein movie, even though I studied animation in college and so forth, and done a little bit of animation on other projects, but not like a feature animated film. And all of the steps you go through, it's very sobering to figure out that process. And I realized a great live action director is almost a little bit like a jazz musician. They get on the set, the actors come in with something, the weather's away a certain day, the set feels a certain way because of the way it's lit. Yeah, everything, there's this group of people that are coming together to get a shot and to get a sequence. And you have to make each one of those things in animation. So it's almost more like a classical composer going over the thing over and over and over. That's why I used to read so many scripts when I was at ILM. And if you saw a great script, it usually ended up being a great film. But you could sometimes see a mediocre script that ended up being a great film. And it was because of all those pieces that come together. The director on a certain day seeing an alt to shoot with the actor that suddenly is the memorable thing of the scene and so forth. You don't get those same sorts of things much in animation. You'll get a voice performer every now and then that'll come up with something, or you'll get an animator who will deliver a little bit of a different performance than you were expecting, but not the kinds of magic you see on the live action set sometimes. So it's interesting to always kind of go through that process. Live action directors look at the stuff and like can't imagine how it's longer than going to college to make one of these films. So the most interesting story is a story that's almost on every film, which is, what were we thinking? And then you get those people together and there was an idea here, and we maybe took the wrong pathway there, but if we shift it here and we bolster it with these folks in this scaffolding, it starts to become something different. And Andrew Stanton said one time when he's writing or making a film, he sets out to make a brontosaurus, but he's really just a paleontologist. So he gets the bones and he thinks they're brontosaurus bones, but as he gets more and more and excavates more, suddenly he realizes it's a stegosaurus, and that's what the movie is. And it's sort of discovered and uncovered as you go what the beating heart of the thing was down there. And it's such a strange process in a way, but when it works right, it's kind of a magical thing.
I think that's such a valuable lesson just by itself, because if you have the full picture, it's very hard for you to be able to pivot and kind of move on your feet and adapt to what's going on. But if you're just piecing together bits and bits as you go, then it's a chance for you to start to adjust your plan or your vision as it goes.
I say doing a 5-year film's a long time. Of course, as we know in live action, if you count the script writing years before something comes to fruition, they're probably not that different in terms of time horizon and so forth. And increasingly, maybe not that even different in the physical production with, so many films being so heavily in effects now. There's so many crossovers in the way that we make our live action and animated movies now, that it's and tropes from both have infused themselves into the other. And I'd say from that point of view, it's a pretty vibrant time for us in this business, that those two sides have come together in a very different way.
Absolutely. And I was curious, like, looking over your career, have there been any big life lessons that you had early on that you've carried with you over this time?
Oh, there have been so many. I have a few. There's a guy named Bob Relier, and he wrote a book called Not So Quiet on the Set. And I met Bob when he had been Steve McQueen's partner, and he produced films like The Great Escape and so forth. But he was head of production at Paramount in the years I was working on Ghost and Flight of the Intruder and Hunt for Red October and so forth. They were all happening around the same time, and he was head of production then. I was talking to him about problems that were coming up and some of the work we were doing, and his kind of mental model was, problems aren't an impediment to the job. Solving problems is the job. And it was one of those things that, you come in and every day on a movie, you get thrown some curveball, or something goes wrong, or you can't get the elements shot you need, or you can't get the plate you need, or you don't get the turnover from the director early enough, whatever all the things are that happen. They happen every day on every movie. And you can either go to work expecting nothing bad to happen and then have to deal with something, or you can go to work expecting a lot of bad things to happen. And then when they do, you're not surprised by it. It's just the job. You kind of take them in stride. And I've always felt that was a great learning kind of early on, that, come into it assuming that the day is going to be fraught with problems that you need to solve. And because it will be. And the days when it's a little lighter, it's kind of a nice win. ILM and Skywalker Sound, I reported to the Lucas board of directors, and there was a guy named Tom Mulaney who was on it, and he was kind of a captain of industry, knew nothing about our business, the entertainment business. I went to him with a problem one time, and it was actually a personnel problem. And he said, he was an Irish guy, and he said, "Jimmy, my boy, you have to look at the situation and decide, does that person belong in your organization or does that person not? And if the answer is no, in your mind, just draw a circle around their face and a slash through it. And you will find a humane way to deal with the next steps of it." And the bigger message there wasn't, that particular one was, as I say, a personnel problem, but the bigger thing I learned from that is separating the decision of a problem from the execution of the solution. Because we can bog ourselves down forever going like, I don't, if I could do that, but I'm not sure how to get there if we do that. And you think of all the reasons not to do something, instead of thinking like, this is the wrong thing, it doesn't work, and decide that doesn't work. You don't have to decide how you're going to solve the problem. You have to decide it's not going to work. And then you will decide how to solve the problem, because you've already forced yourself to have to do that by making the first decision. So sort of bifurcating the decision from the execution is one of those things that is just so useful in so many things in life to think about. So, those are two kind of learnings that kind of happened early-ish in my career that I go back to a lot and think about a lot, and tell people it's amazing how liberating those things can be in terms of helping you approach the kind of work we do, as I say, you're going to get curveballs thrown at you every day. And there's not going to be enough money, and there's not going to be enough time, and you're going to have somebody who's upset, and you're going to have somebody that didn't show up, and you're going to, all of those things you have to come up with a solution for. But that's the gig, you know. I think you have to, as a supervisor and as an artist, you have to do it creatively to make everything work. And I have to kind of do it as an executive or a producer to make everything work. So,
yeah, no, I love that. It's such great advice. Like, even on the not so much fun subject of letting people go, it's always emotion that makes you bleed out for a few more weeks while you ponder the decision that you kind of already made early on. You're just trying to deal with it.
That was the beauty of that, was acknowledging it, making the decision and not worrying about how to execute it. It's a very liberating thing. And I think also going along with that, you know, when you have hard news to give people, whether it's firing them or whether it's some other hard news, is really thinking about, how could I hear this news if it were me? Like, what's the best way I could hear this? What's the most empathetic way I could hear this if it was being said to me? How could I not be demoralized or hold my head up high? How can I do that? So I find that's a helpful thing too. So even if you have to fire somebody or have that kind of difficult thing, it's very rarely because they're not a good person. They're usually perfectly good people. An impedance mismatch, or they're not quite the right tool for the job, or they don't quite have the skills you thought they did to do that job. And it's not because they're bad humans or anything. And so you need to leave people, you need to leave their ego intact with these things. And if you do it right, you can. You know, we've all been fired off jobs one way or another in some way, shape, or form. You know, and you think back on, like, how was that for me, and could that have been better? And you kind of bring that to when you have to have similar difficult situations, difficult conversations, and so forth.
Absolutely. I think it's been really great, and I'm extremely grateful for your time as well. It's been really awesome just to hear you share some of the many insights that you have. So thank you again for your time.
Well, thanks for asking me, and best to you.